Now that we have a basic idea of the gross anatomy of bone, let's talk about the microscopic anatomy of bone, the cells and the little microstructures that make up bone. Osteogenic cells are bone cells that are mitotically active stem cells. Mitotically active, they are actively undergoing mitosis, they divide a lot, and they're stem cells. They can differentiate into other types of cells that are found in the periosteum and the endosteum. Specifically within the periosteum, they're found in the inner, aka cellular layer of the periosteum. I prefer cellular, but either one will work. These can differentiate into osteoblasts, which builds bone. It lays down bony matrix. Bone lining cells, which maintain bone tissue. Or they may just simply stay as osteogenic cells, waiting to differentiate based on the needs of the bone. Mostly they're going to convert into bone lining cells. Around areas of growth, they'll convert into osteoblasts, and in between they may stay as bone lining cells, waiting to see whether or not they should turn into blasts or bone lining cells. For purposes of the exam, you'll need to use the whole word osteoblast, osteoclast, bone lining cell. In the lecture, I do, out of habit, unfortunately, tend to shorten these into like blasts and clasts and things like that. So please take pains when you're practicing to remember to use the full word. These are flattened, simple squamous epithelial cells. Osteoblasts take on a little bit more of a cuboid type of arrangement. Osteocytes tend to be totally flat. Osteogenic cells tend to be very, very flat as well. But strictly speaking, they're all their own kind of mesothelial cell for the bone. They're simple squamous. Osteoblasts are bone-forming cells. Blasts build bone. Blasts build bone. And what they do is they secrete something called osteoid, which is the bone matrix. Osteoid is collagen that has extra proteins that help minerals stick to it. So osteoblasts lay down collagen, extra sticky collagen. And this is the basic initial framework of your bone that's going to get filled in with all that mineral component that makes it rigid, that's your calcium storage. Osteoblasts are themselves also actively mitotic, and they have, like I said, sort of a cuboidal look when they're active, and they're flat when they're inactive, as they're starting to convert over into osteocytes or into something that looks more like bone lining cells. Osteoclasts break down bone. Clasts, this is my mnemonic device, clasts crush for calcium. The osteoclasts break down bone so that you can take the calcium that you're storing in your bones and bring it into your bloodstream. Your nerves need a ton of calcium to work. Your muscles need a ton of calcium to work. You will find in the next units that that is an essential molecule for the functioning, basic functioning of either of those types of tissues. It's not super abundant in a hunter-forager diet, so your body's inclined to pack it away. It also helps your bones get rigid. So it has sort of a double feature to that. But when you need some of that calcium and you're not consuming it, you're going to need to harvest it from your bone. There's deep plasma membrane infoldings on the osteoclasts to maximize the surface area of the side of the osteoclast that is touching the bone under it. So you can see there, it's almost like, but not actually, that there's a million little microvilli there. And along that surface, they're going to secrete enzymes and very strong acids, which will dissolve the calcium out of the osteoid. The osteoclast can then absorb it and deposit it into the bloodstream. As they etch down into bone, they'll live in deep grooves. They're going to make deep grooves. They live in those grooves, and they'll eventually die in those grooves as well. Osteocytes are osteoblasts which have been completely covered up by matrix. So you have the surface of a bone, And here you have a happy, active osteocyte. And the osteocyte is laying down, it laid down all of this matrix, all of this sticky collagen, and it's also secreting it around itself. And as it gets completely surrounded by collagen, by its osteoid, it basically entombs itself. You see this word a lot with osteocytes, entombs. It's entombed. Once that osteoblast has entombed itself, it's completely surrounded by matrix, then it's called an osteocyte, and they become a lot less active overall. It does not have osteoid touching all of its immediate surroundings. There's space around, so the osteoid comes close but doesn't directly touch the osteocyte. It does leave itself some space so it can exchange nutrients and deposit wastes. That space is called the lacunae. Think of it like a lagoon. On a microscopic slide, it looks like you have an osteocyte or a chondrocyte. Cartilage has this feature as well, that's resting in its own sort of hole within the tissue around it, its own little lagoon, lacunae. And it conforms to the overall shape of the cell. Osteocytes have these long projections that reach out between layers of matrix to communicate with other bone cells and to have better, more consistent access to the bloodstream. These osteocytes don't really continuously build bone anymore so much, but they act as sensors that respond to mechanical stimuli, and then they can in turn differentiate based on what's going on. So your bones need stress to maintain their mass. Your bones build themselves up in response to stress. If you think about like what are the recommendations for like little old ladies who are getting osteoporosis, what do you tell them to do? You tell them to eat more calcium, you tell them to eat more vitamin D, maybe take some estrogen, and do some basic weight-bearing exercise. When your muscles pull on the periosteum and they pull on the bone, you're sending signals to the bone. The bone's going to sense that pulling, that mechanical stress at its osteocytes. And those osteocytes are going to get turned on and be like, oh my God, there's all this pulling on me. I need to put down more bone or else I'm going to break. They'll differentiate into osteoblasts and build more bone. In absence of that stress, in an extreme example, if you're in space for very long and you're weightless, where there's no pull on your bones even when you're moving around because there's no gravity that you're opposing, your osteoclasts will be stimulated. Your osteoblasts will not be called into action. Your osteoclasts will, and instead of eating your calcium, your body's just going to harvest it, because what's the point in spending all this energy and saving up calcium that you're not even using, or that you don't even need because there's no stress on your bones. Having low blood calcium also stimulates osteoclasts. If you are not consuming enough calcium, then your osteoclasts will spring into action to harvest from your bone. After meals, your osteoblasts are stimulated. Why? Presumably, there is some at least trace amounts of calcium in whatever food that you eat, and unless you need to use that right that second, you want to pack that away for later storage. Bone lining cells are periosteal cells and endosteal cells. I mentioned that already. They're basically the cellular layer of the periosteum and the endosteum that's not doing other stuff. They simply sit on the bone surface and help maintain the bone tissue underneath. They're flat cells on bone surfaces where remodeling is not going on. And remodeling is basically the breaking down and building up, that continuous back and forth process that your body is always doing to your bone. They also regulate the passage of calcium into and out of bones. You can only lay down so much calcium at a time, so you don't want your bones flooded with a bunch of calcium that you're not going to use. It lets in whatever calcium is needed. It'll also let out whatever calcium the bloodstream needs that your osteoclasts are harvesting. So how are these organized within the compact bone? Osteocytes and bone tissue are organized into osteons. The most basic unit of bone tissue, compact bone tissue. Is the osteon. These are long cylinders of bone matrix ossified with hydroxyapatite, that calcium stuff, in the direction of the bone. So if you have, again, cartoony long bone here, your osteons are going to be organized in that direction. On this slide, you can see an osteon is each of these big tree rings. So there's one, there's one, there's one, for example. And this is a cross section, so you don't see the length of them so much. You see it's like if you cut down a tree and you looked at the stump. These are tiny, tiny weight-bearing pillars, and they're arranged into the column shape to make the bone sturdy against stress of gravity. The collagen inside of these layers is organized in a slightly different way, but overall, the osteon takes this cylindrical shape. They have growth rings like tree trunks. In here, you have a central canal, which has blood vessels and nerves. And then you have some osteoblasts. They're laying down matrix actively around them. They'll become entombed, like this guy right here, or this guy, and they'll sort of get pushed out from the central canal through the osteon. And as you have this outward growth with these cells that are sort of laying down mostly in a sideways direction, you end up with this ring appearance. Each ring is called a lamella. An osteon, the basic unit of compact bone tissue, is made up of layers of concentric lamellae, each with its own osteocytes and lacunae. In between these circles, these osteons, so here's another one, you'll see these straight stripy areas. Those are called interstitial lamella. Interstitial refers to in between. Circumferential lamella is on the outside of the bone. So the outermost layer of compact bone, you have a stripy sort of layer of osteon tissue that encircles the whole bone. Think of it like a girdle holding together all of those sticks that make up the length of the bone. So you have concentric lamella, which are part of the osteon. Each one represents an osteocyte that's been entombed, that's surrounded itself by matrix, and it's getting pushed out in this circular fashion away from the central canal. You have interstitial lamella, which are between those round osteons. And then you have one outer circumferential lamella, which is the outermost layer of compact bone tissue that surrounds all of those osteons and hugs them together like a girdle. Each one of these osteons is going to need a blood supply. It's going to need to feed itself, and you're going to want to be able to share molecules with other neighboring osteons or with other neighboring osteocytes. Blood vessels penetrate the circumferential lamella, the outermost layer of compact bone, by way of nutrient foramina, holes that blood vessels go through. Your nerve supply also enters through these nutrient foramina. These will enter the bone. So here you have a blood vessel in the fibrous periosteum. It penetrates through the cellular periosteum and the nutrient foramina, and it goes into the middle. And eventually it communicates with the middle of those osteons. That middle of the osteon that holds nerves and blood vessels is called the central canal. Perforating canals provide routes for waste and nutrients to come and go between the central canal and the osteocyte. So if you have an osteon here, central canal here, and an osteocyte here, you'll have these little perpendicular cracks, basically, that communicate the osteon and its lacuna with the central canal so that wastes can percolate through that canal. Osteocytes are connected to one another. Remember, they have those long projections that go out side to side. They communicate with one another by gap junctions. As those gap junctions can't be filled with matrix, and the matrix is going to surround the cells except for where osteocytes are connected to one another by gap junctions, you'll find canaliculi. And those are canals that connect osteocytes to one another. So a nutrient foramina enters the bone and communicates with a central canal that's in the middle of the osteon. Perforating canals connect the central canal with different osteocytes, and osteocytes are connected by have a communicating tube between them one another called canaliculi, and that represents where gap junctions were when they communicate originally. Spongy bone, you've seen this before. It looks like a really disorganized arch network, but those arches aren't actually as disorganized as it seems when you're zoomed really close in at a microscopic level. They actually align along lines of stress. Your bone is going to lay down bone tissue based on the stressors that it experiences. So again, you're building bone in reaction to mechanical stress or chemical stress because or chemical influence when you have a lot of extra nutrition in your bloodstream that you want to lay down. So your body is going to build up your bone tissue along the path that stress takes. That includes in spongy bone. So those arches overwhelmingly are going to align along those stress levels. Arches individually are called trabeculi. So if you have a bone, again, super cartoony end of bone here, if you have a stressor that's pulling on the end of the bone this way a lot, you're going to have trabeculi that go in all kinds of different directions, but you're going to have more of them that's parallel to the stressor than perpendicular to the stressor, and that's going to help that bone resist the stress without breaking. If you put down more perpendicular trabeculi in response to the direction of the stress, you're breaking the twig sort of in the middle, and it wouldn't be as effective. Trabeculi lack osteons. They're irregularly arranged lamellae, basically. Osteocytes are connected to one another by canaliculi still within those trabeculi, and blood vessels will sort of weave between the trabeculi, but they're not arranged in those concentric osteons like you see in compact bone. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about bone development. The inorganic compound that makes up a lot of bone is called hydroxyapatite. We talked about that as the calcium-based chalk-like mineral that makes bones seem like rocks. Your osteoblasts lay down osteoid, which is collagen, that sticky collagen, and the hydroxyapatite packs in and around that collagen. It sticks to the collagen in the matrix. This is why bones are so hard, is that hydroxyapatite component. It's also why bones last so long even after you die. A lot of your body is going to deteriorate completely. It's going to decay completely with time in the grave, including the collagen. But calcium minerals don't really decay because they are not inherently biological materials. So that will remain in its shape after death. That's also why bones will be more brittle long after death than they would have been in life. Osteoid is the collagen, right? So you have hydroxyapatite, this mineral component, packed around collagen. Collagen is flexible, but it's strong. Hydroxyapatite is strong, but it's brittle. Together, these two make a bone that has a little bit of give so that every tiny pebble that hits you doesn't break a bone. And it also is strong enough to keep you upright. If your body were just matrix and had no hydroxyapatite, you would be a puddle of, you'd be a Gumby-like puddle of goo on the floor. You wouldn't be able to hold yourself upright against gravity. If you were all hydroxyapatite and no collagen, your body would be too rigid and breakable. It'd be very fragile. Your bones would break very, very easily. So the organic compounds of bone, we've talked about the cells of the bone, and osteoid, which is this ground substance, and collagen fibers. And I told you that the osteon has these concentric lamellae, but the collagen fibers within each lamella are not necessarily oriented in the same overall cylindrical, parallel to the length of the bone direction. What you'll find is that the collagen is laid down in multiple layers at angles against one another. And in between each of those individual collagen fibers, and in between each layer of collagen, you find fibers called sacrificial fibers, sacrificial bonds. What this does is it makes it so that energy, when a bone is impacted, can dissipate rather than just cracking straight through the whole bone. So if you have an impact on the bone, if that energy goes into breaking bonds here, that energy will be released and cannot be transferred to the layer of bone or layer of collagen behind it, deep to it, or at least less energy will be able to communicate with it. If they stayed intact where they touched each other directly, you do more damage to the underlying bones. The analogy I like to give is parallel parked cars. So if you have a line of cars that are parked along, they're parallel parked right up against each other. If they're parked literally bumper to bumper where they're touching, and a Mack truck comes and slams the car in the back of the line, every car in line is going to have damage. That energy, because all those cars are touching, are going to be transferred straight through. If you put, let's say, a handful of pool noodles in between each of the bumpers of each of the cars, that pool noodle will either spring away or absorb some of the force of that impact, and less would be transferred to the car in front of it. So fewer cars far away from the Mack truck would be damaged than if they were all touching directly. And that's how your body lays down matrix. It lays them down in perpendicular sheets across one another for strength. You have hydroxyapatite for rigidity, but between them you have these sacrificial bonds, which are there and designed to break in order to release energy so that the bone so that the energy won't be transferred further into the bone than it has to. Your bone will stay safer longer.